Welcome, everybody. My name is Henry Hale. I am director of Ponars, co-director with Marlene Laruelle, and a professor of political science and international affairs here at George Washington University's Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies. And I'm very happy on behalf of our institute and its Russia program to welcome Gulnaz Sharafutdinova of King's College London, who will be presenting and discussing her new book, The Afterlife of the Soviet Man, Rethinking Homo Sovieticus, with us. She is the author of many other great publications that I would highly recommend, including the award-winning Red Mirror. And we're also delighted to have with us today Jill Doherty, who I think needs no introduction. She's a Russia expert in her own right, but also very well known, of course, for her time working with CNN. So what we'll do today is ask Gulnaz to give a short presentation of her book, and then Jill will lead us on a discussion of the material and some of the thoughts that it provokes with the author, and then we'll open it up for general discussion and questions. So for those of you online, please pose your questions in the chat, and I will relay them to the authors during the question and answer period. So thank you all for joining us, and let me turn things over to Gulnaz.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone who is here, and thank you, everyone who is at the audience on the hybrid online. I want to first just maybe start with recognizing the privilege that allows me to write the book such as this and to speak about the issues. I think that recognition is really important in the context that we live in, and in the context of the war in the region, speaking about the terms and intellectual history of the terms, calling for maintaining humanism and recognition of humanity in the context of war, can only be done if you are at a faraway distance from violence itself, from the war. And so, I do come to this conversation and to presenting my book, realizing that, right? So I think that dose of humility and humbleness is really needed. Now, the book was in a way related to the earlier book, The Red Mirror, that Henry mentioned. And that book tried to understand what's happening in Russia with Russian people, with Russian politics after the Crimea annexation. And as I was writing that book, one of the persistent ideas and approaches to explaining what's happening in Russia was linked to the concept of Homo Sovieticus. And the concept in its Cold War version refers to the effects, social, psychological, mental effects of living under totalitarian communist system. So in its very essence, that's what Homo Sovieticus is how the system, political system, which is based on indoctrination and repression and state control and socialized economy, how that system affects people's attitudes, people's modes of behavior and practices, and even it was taken to the extent as to suggest that it creates a specific personality trait, that there is a specific type of persona that could be referred to as Homo Sovieticus, right? So this concept re-emerged in the public space among individuals, intellectuals within the Russian public sphere, and also to an extent among the intellectuals and observers in the Western public sphere. And having worked and inquired into this term and what it means and where it's coming from, I thought that it would be a contribution to this debate across the countries to position, to ground the term and to ground the history of the term, to historicize it and to show the political and historical context in which it emerged, and to suggest in the end that the term is far from being a scientific term that can be used to characterize, social phenomena. And, in the end, I came to the conclusion of the importance of thinking through the power knowledge connections that are at the basis of the terms that we use. And the Homo Sovieticus, for me, in the end, emerged as the result of the politics of the Cold War. And I tell this story, and Matt, if you can give us the just 2 slides that I have there with the portraits of my main heroes. The book is probably in the genre of intellectual biography, and I look at 5 men and 1 woman who have it's rather arbitrary choice. The choices could have been also different. I chose these individuals maybe because there are many references to them, but they are well-known writers, journalists, philosophers, anthropologists who have provided, the public debate during the Cold War and after the Cold War with some essential meanings of what a Homo Sovieticus is. So in the book, I look at I inquire into Czesław Miłosz. His book Captive Mind was probably the earliest intervention into the analysis of how socialism, how communism affects psychology, and how, why, from his perspective, he was trying to understand why intellectuals in Poland, writers and poets in Poland, were enamored and fell under the influence of the communist state and Marxist ideology, this new faith. What was so attractive in that new faith? So he tried to go through these psychological explanations of how Marxism settled and was adopted by Polish intellectuals. And then I look at Alexander Zinoviev and also Vladimir Bukovsky, 2 writers, dissidents in Bukovsky, human rights activists, who who left the Soviet Union and outside the Soviet Union wrote a lot of novels, writings, books that also inquired into the essence of how the Soviet communism affected society and people and individual psychology. And I also look at Georgy Markov, a writer, playwright from Bulgaria. Now, if you ask me what's similar among all these individuals, is that they were dissidents and anti-communist fighters, right? So for them, fight against communism and the politics of Cold War was central to their identities, and most of their critical ideas with regards to communism they were able to express in the West. And in the West, they also had a very fertile ground for reception of these ideas, right? And now one person who stands out among the dissidents is Yuri Levada, right? So he's another scholar, sociologist who I look at, and yet he is a dissident in his own right. He's an academic dissident who was in some ways repressed professionally in the Soviet Union, but at the end of the Soviet Union was able to put into practice and to realize some of the ideas that were exciting to him, analytical and theoretical ideas that he was excited about from the 50s and 60s that he wasn't able to realize earlier, but he was able to realize in the late 80s during the perestroika. And so in the book, I go through the analytical anatomy of sorts of how he designed and what is the analytical foundation of his big survey and research project on the late Soviet man, that the project with which had a long legacy after the early, its exposition in the book in 1993 book, because Thevada Center continued these surveys throughout the 90s and also in the 2000s. And while the Levada sociologists thought that the traits that they found of the Soviet men would go away within the new system, but that didn't happen. And in 2011, there is this short article in The Economist, The Long Life of Homo Sovieticus, that Soviet man is back. And these ideas, turned quite important after 2014 specifically. Another person who stands out from the anti-communist fighters and dissidents, Eastern European and Soviet, and also Levada, is another scholar, sociocultural anthropologist, Natalia Kozlova. Now, that individual is not well known in the West, as opposed to all other individuals I wrote about, and I go into her, inside out approach to understanding Soviet society that she was following through in the late 90s and early 2000s. And in a way, I juxtapose her approach to Levada's approach, and show how, you can study Soviet men in a different way, which is sociologically grounded in contemporary theories, but is very different in its approach, and it's very different in its results. And the book ends with bringing yet another person, Yuri Levada, and he is comes out a little bit maybe flamboyantly. He's not a dissident, not a scholar, but it is my way to search for some degree of hope in the Russian society, and to look at, okay, what type of signs and identity cues can we learn about from the person who has millions and millions of followers in Russia and outside Russia. And so for me, in the conclusion, to think about the sources of hope for the Russian society, I try to inquire into those identity cues and role model, looking at Dud as a role model that seems to be quite popular for many Russians, not all Russians, but many Russians. So the Homo post-Sovieticus that is given through the discourses and choices and meanings that Dud is conveying to his audience bring me to the point that allows for, maybe some controversy and provocation, and yet a bit of hope with regards to the Russian society. I think I'll stop at that if I may, and let Jill talk.
Okay, we can hand the floor over now to Jill Doherty.
And I'm not going to talk, but I'm going to ask some questions. I was really, really glad. Thank you for asking me to do this, because I'm a huge fan. In fact, I want your signature on this book as soon as we're finished. I'm a huge fan of Gulnaz because she writes, to me, very, very interesting books, academically grounded, no question. But you also get into, I would say, like the humanity, the human aspect of life in Russia and then life in the Soviet Union. And here, with this concept of, the Soviet man is Sovietsky человек, I was intrigued right from the beginning, because you said the afterlife, so I thought, what does that mean? Because as you were saying, in the beginning, it was always kind of a duality about the expression, the Soviet man. But if you go back to the Bolsheviks, they had the new Soviet man, which was supposed to be very positive. And then, so we take the Soviet man, the rebirth of the term now is very negative. I mean, it's completely black and white. I report on and, write about and follow events dealing with Ukraine, et cetera. And a lot of the reporting that I do is focused on Russia. And the idea is, or at least if you take this Soviet man concept, it is negative because it says there's no hope. This is what the Russians are like. They're all automatons. They just follow what the government says, and a very, negative understanding. And what I really liked about this was you opened up the phrase and really brought in even where it came from, you know? So I think maybe there's so many questions, where do we begin? But maybe we begin with Levada, because I think a lot of us know Levada. His Thevada Center is still doing polling. It's probably the most reliable, even though it's very difficult to do polling today. But you say that when Levada developed this idea of Homo Sovieticus, he thought it was a dying breed. He thought this was kind of the end of it. Here he is in late 80s, early 90s. Soviet Union ends in 1991, and Homo Sovieticus was supposed to be something from the past. So could you begin there? Like, obviously it's not of the past, but it's not quite of the present either. So, you know, explain that.
Yes, so I think the answer to that puzzle that emerged for Levada scholars, and it's a group of sociologists associated with first CIOM and then they became Thevada Center, was their faith in, you know, in certain theories and approaches. And for Levada, something that he found to be very important, significant to him, was a theory of structural functionalism that was developed by Talcott Parsons in the 50s and 60s in the United States. Now, that was a sociology that provided an alternative to Marxist sociology that resonated. And, you know, we probably shouldn't go too much into depth into theoretical aspects, but let me just suggest that Parsons' sociology was as systemic and structural as Marxism is. And the cognitive pathways of someone who is brought up in, you know, in Hegel's dialectics and in Marxist structural thinking, an alternative but a very systemic approach to analyzing society is very attractive. It provides all of a sudden a very nicely, you know, elegant, well-structured understanding of how society works. And so, and yet it's not Marxism. So for someone who is critical of communist realities and unsatisfied with Marxism as an ideological doctrine that is imposed on everyone, this systemic approach is very attractive and alternative. Now, Levada himself was not able to realize it. He tried to give some lectures in the 60s and he was kicked out of his place because it was American sociology. So he had to then go a bit underground. He had another job position and they created a whole network of informal gatherings where they invited scholars from Tartu, you know, all kinds of alternative thinking scholars, intellectuals into their informal circles, right? So he was able to realize those ideas more informally. But the time came for him in the late 80s when Tatiana Zaslavskaya invited Levada as someone who can provide an alternative and who can. So he brought those earlier, you know, excitements into work in the late 80s. Right now, but if you think about, say, the American sociology and how it evolved, right, by late 80s, that structural functionalism was found to be, you know, outdated as a theory, very much equilibrium biased because it was explaining stability. And for why it really mattered for Levada, because he wanted to explain stability. Right, Marxism was there to explain change, and structural functionalism was to explain stability, and so they liked it very much. And then added to that systemic approach was also totalitarianism. Right, by late 80s, when communism was unraveling, when all the glasnost, all the new information, Stalinism, there was a very critical atmosphere, and theory of totalitarianism took hold over minds of Russian intellectuals. And so when you combine totalitarian framework with this systems structural functionalism theory, what you have is structural functionalism explains the political institutions, right, which are totalitarian in nature, and there is an output of that system, and the output of the system is the human byproduct, right? So it's like, it works like a machine of sorts, right? So it's a nice, theoretical, elegant machine. And so, you know, I think we should recognize that when Levada and sociologists around him were undertaking this project, they believed in this. They really believed in what they were doing, right? In this construct, right? But what should also be noted is that this construct was, you know, it's like an analytical construct that you impose on the society, right? But it had a certain content, because in the theory and totalitarian approach, there was another ideal lurking on the background, that there is a free society with an autonomous free man who is autonomous, free to express his ideas. So there was that ideal against which the individual who is born and raised in the Soviet Union in a totalitarian society was constructed. So when they designed their surveys, they had already certain ideas that they input from their minds, not necessarily, you know, empirically studied, but based on these frameworks, right? So it's in a way an outside-in driven design, where you have a theoretical expectation that you impose, and they had certain findings. So they found and they organized that the attitudes could be characterized, you know, as such and such. But their theory suggested that because it works in such a way, because of how political institutions are organized, when political institutions are out and down, and when they change, and when people are allowed free space for discussions, for conversations, for questioning their history, for entrepreneurialism, etc., that individual thinking and attitudes will change, right? So that was the logical expectation. And indeed, they were very surprised when they found a certain, you know, that they found those attitudes still sometimes even growing in the 2000s. So they were really surprised. Now, what will a scientist do in such circumstances? A scientist would say, okay, if my expectations were not met by the empirics, I need to change my analytical approach, right? That's okay. What are the alternative theories that explain it, right? But Levada himself, you know, a highly respected hero of Soviet and then Russian sociology, was of such a nature that, you know, they sort of, they couldn't question, they didn't question it, and they're still not questioning it. So there are no alternative approaches that Thevada Center developed to, you know, to explain this reality. They just, you know, what I saw, and I mentioned Lev Gutkov, what he did was that there was an interesting analytical reversal when they said, you know, so I explained how theory, you know, how structures produce a human byproduct, a Homo Sovieticus, right? Now, what the sociologists did in 2000s, they said, well, because this byproduct has survived, now it causes authoritarian reversal. So they interestingly, and when you read Gutkov, you see that tautology. So they started from the analytical point of view of institutions causing a human byproduct, but then they found that human byproduct survives. And then they said, well, that's an interesting response to why Russia turned authoritarian, right? So I tried to bring that out a little bit to show, well, certain analytical issues with such thinking.
Yeah, well, it's so meaty, but you know, right from the beginning, there's that duality, and I'm really struck by that. Savok, maybe you know that word, you know, like a Soviet guy, very negative, and then at the same time, right now, we have Soviet nostalgia in which people are saying, gee, I miss standing in line because I was with my friends and we were able to catch up on the news. You know, there are these positive things that keep coming back, and we don't have to go deeply into it, but I'm just kind of intrigued by that duality. I'll just read one quote, which is fantastic. Zinoviev back in, well, I guess you'd have to tell me, maybe early, but he says, this book is about a Soviet person as a new type of human being. My relationship to that person is dual: love, respect, and admiration for him side by side by my hatred, contempt, and dread for this person. I am Homo sauce, you know, not, and even though this is the beginning of Gay Pride Month, we're not talking about homosexuals here. So I am, you know, a Soviet person myself. Therefore, I will be cruel and merciless in my exposition. So duality, how do you explain that?
Yes, no, I think in Zinoviev's writing, that duality where he is both critical. So he, first of all, he understands that he's a Soviet man, Alexander Zinoviev. He left the Soviet Union and went into exile and then returned in 1999 after the bombing of Belgrade, was very enraged and didn't support Gorbachev and Perestroika, actually. So there are contradictions on contradictions on contradictions. And when you go into those contradictions of these individuals who, you know, develop this approach and this thinking, then you understand that what we know just about black and white divisions is very simplified and reductionist view. So for Zinoviev, when he is trying to be both critical, but also says he loves it, you know, what I point out about him is that he was, back to his education, brought up studying like philosophy and logic and very much a big proponent of dialectics. So, and that the role of Hegelian dialectics and the presence of, you know, black and whites together is very much present, not only in Zinoviev's writing and thinking, but also for that matter, Levada himself. So when they designed their project of studying simple Soviet men, they thought about, you know, when they designed, okay, what are we going to look for? They analytically weaved into what they called antinomies. So if we are studying the issue of identity, we're going to study both Soviet internationalism, how people connected to other nations and thought about multinational nature, but also about their sort of inward looking, more parochial attitudes coexisting together when they speak about this hierarchical egalitarianism. The whole term is a paradox in itself, hierarchical egalitarianism. They were trying to put this understanding that Soviet man is both, you know, likes or lives in the context of you know, sort of egalitarianism, and yet there are always hierarchies to which the Soviet man responds to, like nomenclature of hierarchy, that power is respected, etc. So this dialectical thinking is one of those, you know, features that you see in many intellectuals who do not just look at a phenomena from one side, but in a way recognize the duality. But another important element on this duality and this you know, complexity that I think is important, and I try to bring it out in the book when I talk about Homo Sovieticus, is how all of these individuals, and not just Levada and Zinoviev, but Bukovsky, Georgy Markov, and Czesław Miłosz, all these people who were unhappy under the communism, they left their countries. They were, you know, pressured to leave, or they were able to escape instead of being jailed, etc. They then, outside of the communist countries, they were able to contribute, you know, in a more open, you know, free speech manner, their understanding of what's happening in their countries. And that knowledge was very much in demand, and that contributed to the rise of this Homo Sovieticus. And yet, if you follow a bit further their biographies and their writings, you find later on that all of them were quite disappointed with their lives in the West. This is something, you know, for me was an interesting learning, because, you know, you have you know, anti-communist, non-conformist, sort of human rights focused, or, you know, anti-government fighters who are extremely brave, who are very intelligent, who write a lot of insightful observations about, in a very critically couched manner, about lives and the gap between what the communism promised and what it achieved, how people actually lived, right? But it seems as if many of them had this ideal about how life could be organized. And that ideal, in pretty much all their cases, was linked to the Western countries and democracies and society, Western societies, democratic societies, and individual lives and values. And it comes out from their memoirs or from their writings, this very strong disappointment where they, where their ideals are in a way crushed. And they complain, so Zinoviev complains about selfishness and immorality. So he was first complaining about Homo Sovieticus being selfish and lacking morals. And then in the next paragraph on Homo Sovieticus, he writes, well, by the way, I'm in the West now, and every Homo Sovieticus in the Soviet Union has a double in the West, right? And they're also very selfish here. It's just that they lack the warmth that we had in the Soviet Union because of collectivism and sociality, et cetera, et cetera. So all those nuances that I try to bring out, they don't usually come up in the, when we talk about Homo Sovieticus, and as when that term is devoid of people who created it and the context in which they emerged. But that disappointment is an interesting, just individual biography feature that can suggest that, the extent to which during the Cold War, the criticism of the communist system had a parallel faith in this, sort of maybe even a rosy glasses, rosy lenses through which the Western systems and democratic systems were looked at. And once they had an opportunity to live there, they recognized that it's not as rosy. So it's an interesting sort of confounding or adding some complexity into, again, how our thinking works and how we come to believe in certain things, and how those beliefs might only sustain themselves until you haven't tried, if it's a black and white world, with communism and sort of juxtaposed against each other, it's this, it constitutes our thinking and our knowledge as well.
We want to have some questions, but I'll ask one. It's kind of a double question, but you mentioned Yuri Levada, and he's very interesting. I follow him a lot, and turn this thing off. And I teach him in a course that I teach at another institution. not far away. And I find him very, very interesting. And I agree, very hopeful. However, Yuri Levada had to leave Russia. He is a foreign agent. So he's out of the country, as everybody who, seems to be these days, who has any sort of a mind. So if you could say just a little bit about why you're hopeful when this man of hope is now out of the country, and then also the influence of this new conversation about important things. This is, do you know that, the разговор о важном, the classes, the courses that now schools in Russia are forced to teach, which is essentially Russia's history and why it was okay to invade Ukraine, etc. This is now changing the minds of young people. And I wonder, it's not even, maybe it isn't Homo Sovieticus, maybe it's something else. Homo Putin,
Z generation.
Yeah, Z generation. But could you just kind of, I guess the question would be, there's hope with Levada. But then I look at what is happening right now in Russia, which brings us back to the Soviet days, or maybe even beyond that.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. That's a great point, Jill. And there is no way that, I want to present sort of my analysis or my ideas as something that brings a lot of hope for the Russian future. It's sort of a, it's maybe like this really forced attempt to find some hope. But indeed, the last, where I talk about the last chapter, which is also a conclusion, I talk about it as Homo Sovieticus as a fight for the continent. So, and that fight includes, right, different sides, and one side are the multi-million audience of Levada and like him, journalists who are more progressive and civic-minded and patriotic in their own ways, and give certain, role model for how, you can, or you need to have values and civicness and think about your country, not only about yourself. But that is, that fights also includes the state and the Kremlin, that is also fighting over the minds and allegiances of Russia's young generation, right? And recent book by Jan Gardner about Z generation sort of brings a very non-hopeful perspective on this conversation, but yet other scholars who study how values are changing and the anti-war position of Russia's youth, etc., so this conversation has different sides, and I think it only reflects that there, that future is uncertain, and there are certain processes that are ongoing, involve different forces that are at play together. And if you were to ask me, a lot will depend on, of course, on the war, what happens on the front, how the war will end, what will happen with the political regime, and then who is empowered, who is in the position of power. So are these, people associated, with those who watched Dude's programming and followed these progressive ideas, or are these individuals who have made career through state controlled institutions and ideas that want to continue the Putinist type logic?
Is Putin a Soviet man?
I think so.
I mean, but I mean, in this, well, it's not a precise definition. As you said, it's not scientific, but is there anything different about him that is not Soviet?
The concept of Sovietness is like, it depends, like, depends, I think, further, he is Soviet to the extent that he was born and raised in the Soviet Union, but he had an exposure with his work in Germany, etc. And he has been associated with bringing back a lot of Soviet practices, but at the same time, he built a personalist dictatorship that is very non-Soviet in its institutional nature. So, from my own perspective, I disagree with the analysis that Putin wants to recreate a Soviet Union. Soviet Union as a political, ideological, social project was, is not comparable to Russia, which combines very different economic and social and inequalities, and the types of problems that are present in Russia today. I think are in many ways different from the Soviet ones. But maybe one thing that I want to bring into discussion, that talking about Homo Sovieticus, and why I think it might be important to look at how ideas and terms gain ground, and how they gain currency, and how it's linked. So I'm trying to make a case that Homo Sovieticus as a term gained ground because of the Cold War having ended with the collapse of communism. Right. And so this negative perspective won out and is frequently used. But what is interesting is that today, the big rhetoric and this conversation about coloniality of Russia and Russian people, and this issue of decolonization and this issue of imperialism, in a very interesting way, sociologists who studied Homo Sovieticus, they sort of didn't notice it. It was sort of a blind spot, right? So certain ideas that came that gained currency because of the politics, were also associated with silencing potential other problems that could have been studied in the Soviet reality. And so it's interesting how Levada points out imperskost, but there is nothing about structural inequalities of ethnic hierarchies in Russia and in the Soviet Union. There isn't understanding, and now I've been reading a lot of things on racism and how racism is constructed, and how racism is a silent issue in the Russian society, and it has been a silent issue in the Soviet society, and it is something that we need to talk about today. So I think sort of taking some currency away from Homo Sovieticus as a Cold War phenomenon and bringing more currency into those silent areas that were not discussed, that were sort of slipped our conversations. And if you look at the individuals I showed, as I was putting them on the board, there are 5 men, all white, all associated with Slavic. You don't see a Chechen or an Uzbek or a Bashkort. You don't see, a woman that I showed is not known in the West, right? So all of a sudden, those things that are talking to us about power knowledge connections become even clear from the photos of individuals that I bring in. But, I'm hoping that by trying to deconstruct what Homo Sovieticus is, the conversation moves to those blind spots, so hopefully, I will not, be sticking to this analysis and to this term, but moving into a different direction a little bit about what Levada didn't see, but is still with us today in Russia in terms of those sociological things on the ground that have been taken for granted, but also made invisible.
All right, yeah, thank you. So let's now open up the discussion to members of the audience. So let me start with one question online from Terry Quist, who asks whether you think Heart of a Dog by Bulgakov might be seen as an early artistic depiction of Homo Sovieticus.
Thank you so much for that question. I do talk in the book about Professor Preobrazhensky and Yuri Levada, like Professor Preobrazhensky, referring to Heart of the Dog. So absolutely, that is an early depiction, and we can go through literature, but also Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, when, Voland comes to Moscow and the only problem is the housing issue, remember? So all those things are very interesting, literary ground that gives us some ideas. So I do talk about them, and I agree that's one in terms of the negative depiction of Homo Sovieticus. That probably is the earlier one. Yes.
Thanks. So we have a question in the front here. Just ask you to identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Antonina Berzavenko. I'm a senior fellow here at GW for this semester, and I'm really grateful for that. And my question is rather the recollection about Putin. I would like to come back to the image of Putin, and he was actually exactly non-Soviet guy when he came into the power. He was really different because he was speaking eloquently, good Russian language, with predicates, like everything you could figure out actually what he was going to say. Secondly, he was using publicly, again, foreign language, like German language. And it was completely different from what we used to hear from the normal, quote unquote, Soviet leaders, who either didn't speak or speak the way that nobody knows what was actually in the point. And in this sense, I remember that several first years, people expected him to be like really Western type, because Russia at that point was still the first country that supposed to bring the democracy in the region. And this was the perception of Putin, and this is my impression and my recollections from those times. And a second thing that I would like to add to what you have said about the egalitarian hierarchy, I think that the guys who produced that term, they were completely like with good agreement with themselves, because they were, I assume, born and raised in the system of the democratic centralism, демократический централизм. So like, what is the difference? I think that these terms, they are just synonymic. So they were really like, acquainted with them. And for them, there is a logic, the Soviet logic, like Savok was still alive by the time that the term was coined. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonina. Yeah. So I was just thinking once back to Jill's question about whether Putin is Soviet, and then what Antonina you added, from my own perspective, I do have problem answering that question, because that presumes that Sovietness is something that could be just identified as something, this essential features, right? And what I'm trying to suggest is that there isn't such essentialized feature. Soviet is very different. And Klaus Mennert, the German journalist who went in the early, like 52, I think he went to the Soviet Union, and he had his own sorts of personal also stories of like until like 10 years old or something, being in the Tsarist Russia and then leaving, and then so he's returning, so he has a love for Russian, etc. So he has this very positive predisposition. But what he points out in his book, very early book on the Soviet Union and Soviet society, is the utter difference of the Soviet society and attitudes and styles of life and ways of life and how people think. And so he's really focusing on that, on those differences. So if we come from that perspective, that Soviet is very different depending on which position you come from, you know, what's your gender, what your ethnic group, what's your position in power, you know, the way you think, the way you approach things might be very different. So I think that might be a bit more sort of comfortable sort of viewpoint for me, because, you know, I do have a problem answering, you know, is Putin Soviet or not, right? What do we mean by this, right?
Okay, I think we have a question. The gentleman in the back, microphone is coming.
Hello, name's George. Searcher more in systems area, systems as applied to societies, and analytic applied mathematics. I'm going to kind of challenge you here. So this is sort of challenge the experts kind of question. Want to find out what the real answer is to this, how you could relate to this. Soviet man, or that kind of system of thought. How does that system of thought look at this kind of logical policy, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Is there something in the Soviet man ideology that relates specifically to that kind of enemy of my enemy is my friend, or a transitive relationship between three different entities?
I don't think I'll be able to give you maybe a very satisfactory answer. I don't think within the Soviet system of thought there is such a thing that is specific from other systems of thought, that is logic, right? That in politics, right? Just it's like sort of a logic of politics where that type of thinking, that an enemy of my enemy is my friend, might be working frequently. Not only it might work in the Soviet Union, outside the Soviet Union, and I would rather think in terms of like Carl Schmittian analysis of politics as a difference between an enemy and a friend. That the essence of politics. So, you know, I recently wrote about how politics could be very different in war times, right? Politics, the way we understand it in the United States, for example, right? It's about, you know, who gets what and how, and, you know, what's happening. You know, remember the recent debate on the debt ceiling, right? The negotiations, right? So that's not necessarily about enemies and existential issues. When it comes to wars, and when it comes to that, you divide the world into black and white, into friends and enemies, that's sort of a politics in a Schmittian sense rather than in like Harold Laswell's sense, right? And in that type of logic where that difference is of existential nature to the outcomes, that logic that you're suggesting, enemy of my enemy is my friend, I think is more fitting. But I wouldn't connect it to necessarily any sort of Soviet system of values or Soviet institutional logic, etc. But rather, if it worked that way, say, if we look at geopolitically at the world that was, you know, divided between the world of, you know, the capitalism and the free world, you know, and the communism sort of, and how the superpowers fought over, you know, different, you know, countries in the third world, and that type of logic in that split world into two camps might have worked on both sides.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Eddie Becker, I'm a documentarian, and I went to a couple of these rallies here in DC supporting Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And one of them had a lot of people who still identify as communists. And I met some people who had gone to the Ukraine as part of the Russian side. And they tell me that not only are they communists, but they're also Russian Orthodox, that they also believe in this faith-based religion that I guess goes back for a long time in Russia. So I started to do the research, and there I'm finding the Patriarch Kirill, who's encouraging people to go and support the troops. I have images of priests, Russian Orthodox priests, bringing drones to the troops. And also, so I'm thinking that this is a much deeper rooted conflict, and that the old Communist Party is now sort of a nationalist party, very large, that this is a nationalist movement, and that evoking the sort of the Holocausts of the past, meaning the Russian invasions, evoke a certain emotion, that there's a sort of post-traumatic trauma that the Russian people went through after World War II, and they're getting back at that root. And this is going to be a long war. And even if they get rid of Putin, nothing will change.
Thank you for sharing your understanding and your discovery of this sort of syncretisms of ideas of communists and orthodoxy coming together. We see it among, the individuals and ideas that became more and more important on the Russian sort of political top echelons of power. We also see a group of people with more orthodox ideas, but also with a lot of background in the Soviet system, who are probably missing communism and missing Soviet Union, who have been able to combine the newly found religious faith in Orthodoxy and its importance. We know from the 90s and 2000 they have traveled to like Mount Afon, I think, in Greek islands, and so that has been quite trendy. But across the Russian space, we see rise of the role of religion in Islamic, Buddhism, paganism to a certain extent. All these, societies do need sort of values, right? And I think in the absence of unified ideology that collapsed after the Soviet Union, religion became to a certain extent a fallback, but also was combined with this Soviet nostalgia and certain sentiments with regards to the greatness and certain warmth with regards to how society operated. But also memories work that way, right? That sometimes you forget the worst and you just remember, the good things. And I think this concoction that's quite contradictory in one way, right? Because Marxism did not allow for religion to have an important place, is very much in play today. Now, but your suggestion that this is for a long time to come, I think might be challenged by observations about, are these ideas strong among the youth? And, the last chapter I read about Yuri Dud, which speaks about what are the criteria of success that Dud follows and offers to his audiences, his young audiences that include millions of Russians. And that criteria for success is, to be a professional, to be good at what you're doing, to earn a lot of money, and to be free to travel, to learn languages, to think about your, nature and people and charity, etc. So those ideas are not nostalgic for the Soviet period, and they are not Orthodox religious in that sense. So from that perspective, I think that pessimism that you have could be challenged by this other side.
Hope so.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a question. A lot of the discussion so far has been about Russia, but having recently researched a book on Zelensky, one of the things that I was struck by is that he was criticized by many of his critics for being a Savok, for being a Homo Sovieticus. And so I'm not going to ask you specifically about that, but I guess I just wonder whether, if you might reflect on whether the concept of Homo Sovieticus has a afterlife outside Russia, maybe in other countries, and what role it might be playing, or what role, how it might be connected to Russianness as opposed to other cultures.
Yeah. So in the 1990s, sociologists outside Russia, in Poland, in other countries, in Ukraine, but especially in Poland, have brought back this idea of, okay, what's, to what extent the communist past impacts attitudes, entrepreneurial practices, openness to change of individuals in their countries. In the 90s, there were like some survey-based research, and they were studying what they called sort of dispositional, sort of these personality type factors that might be linked to the past, as opposed to situational factors, how people react to the context, to the situation. And the published research suggested that, and these authors in Poland, they came to the conclusion that situational factors overtake any type of dispositional factors, so we don't need to worry about Savok. So from that perspective, so the topic itself, the influence of the communist system and how it affects, I mean, it was studied, or there were attempts to study it empirically, and the scholars came to the conclusion that the concept is not really carrying any analytical leverage. So that's one thing. But that doesn't mean that in everyday life, especially in the former Soviet space, you wouldn't hear the denigrating Savok, or in the Russian context now, Vatniki, based on just political orientation. And if you are calling for the greatness and for the Soviet nostalgia is very much present, not only in Russia, but in many parts of of the former Soviet Union. And when we look at war attitudes, in countries like Kyrgyzstan or Uzbekistan, the pro-Russian attitudes are very strong, right? And in all of those situations, people could be blamed as Vatniki or Savok or whatnot. Now on Zelensky, we just started watching the Sluga Naroda, the servant of the people. And, as someone who hasn't been able to really watch Russian series, because sometimes they were so sort of crude or just not tasteful, the lightness of humor and the lightness of approach that Zelensky brings to in that Sluga Narodu, and the producers of that, I think he was one of the producers too, but he probably didn't write the play itself. It's actually to me was very impressive in its the groundedness in today. I'm interested in why he might be thrown such such labels, because Sluga Naroda is actually as a cultural product, for someone watching it with like decades and decades living in the West, seems quite an interesting thing that's not Soviet at all in style. So
Okay. I think we may have 1 or 2 minutes to squeeze in a last question if anybody has one. Otherwise, I think, unless Jill has a final question, I think we can just wrap up. And thank you to our author for writing a great book, which provoked a great conversation. And thanks to Jill for joining us and leading that great conversation today. And thank you all for attending.
thank you. All right. Thank you.